I grew up in a world where every move was measured, every word was calculated. My father was a military man, a man who believed that life was nothing more than a series of strategic maneuvers. From as early as I can remember, he instilled in me the principles of discipline, control, and efficiency. Emotions were liabilities, and friendships were nothing more than potential assets or liabilities. I learned quickly that trust was earned through utility, not affection. Every day, his stern gaze and relentless instructions drilled into me the idea that life was a chess game, and I was destined to be a master strategist. In that environment, I became adept at seeing people as pieces on a board. I never truly believed in the idea of friendship, only in useful acquaintances who could help me move closer to my goals. I calculated every conversation, every encounter, as if I were playing a game where the stakes were my future. For me, vulnerability was a weakness to be exploited, not a shared human experience. I was confident that with enough planning, every relationship could be controlled, every outcome predicted. Then, everything changed when I met Laura. I remember the first time I saw her. She was nothing like the people I had come to expect in my meticulously arranged life. Where I was precise and guarded, Laura was spontaneous and untamed. There was an undeniable spark in her eyes, a hint of chaos that both terrified and intrigued me. I thought I could tame that wild spirit, convinced that I could bring her into the order I so rigorously maintained in every other aspect of my life. At the time, I believed I could bend her to my will, mold her into someone who fit neatly into the carefully constructed plans I had for my future. I assumed that, with enough discipline and strategic maneuvering, I could control every facet of her personality. I was so certain of my methods that I ignored the signs, the subtle defiance in her smile, the unplanned detours in her conversations, and the way she laughed at moments I considered calculated. In my mind, love was just another variable to be managed, another piece in the grand equation of my life. Looking back now, I realize how naive I was. My upbringing had taught me that every relationship had a price, that every person was a potential pawn in my game. I approached my marriage to Laura with the same cold precision that had been drilled into me since childhood, believing that if I could just apply enough strategy, I could turn even the most unpredictable force into a loyal partner. I thought I could rewrite the rules of attraction, controlling passion the way one controls a well-oiled machine. But from the very beginning, Laura was a wild card. The moment she stepped into my ordered existence, the predictable pattern of my life started to warp. Her very presence was a rebellion against everything I had been raised to value. While I saw relationships as transactions, exchanges of benefits and calculated risks, Laura believed in the beauty of unpredictability, the thrill of spontaneity, and the power of genuine emotion. And that was the first twist in a game I thought I had already won. I often wonder if I was destined to learn the hard way that not everything can be controlled or predicted. My father's lessons served me well in many arenas, but with Laura, they only prepared me for a battle against forces that defied all my carefully laid plans. Even as I tried to mold our life together into something that fit my design, I couldn't help but notice that every time I tightened my grip, Laura found a way to slip through. It was as if she carried within her the chaos of the world, something that could never be fully tamed by logic or strategy. Now, as I look back on those early days, I see a reflection of a man who believed he could outsmart fate with sheer willpower and rigid control. I was convinced that every person, every emotion, could be accounted for by a formula. But Laura's existence was a constant reminder that life doesn't always adhere to the rules we impose. And even though I tried so hard to keep everything in line, there were moments when her unpredictable nature shattered the illusion of order I had built around myself. That was the beginning of my journey, a journey where every step I took was challenged by forces I could neither calculate nor command. It was a lesson in humility and unpredictability, a lesson that would eventually force me to confront the limits of control and the true nature of human connection. And so, here I am, sharing my story, not as a tale of triumph over chaos, but as an account of how the wild, unmanageable essence of another person can upend everything you thought you knew about strategy, control, and the very nature of life itself. Lately, I'd been feeling an overwhelming fatigue that I couldn't quite explain, but Laura insisted I go to the doctor. Reluctantly, I agreed, expecting a routine checkup at best. Instead, I left the sterile white walls of that clinic with news that shattered the illusion of control I'd so carefully maintained. Stage for pancreatic cancer. The doctor's clinical tone confirmed it. 6 to 10 months, maybe less. It was a verdict that not only threatened my carefully constructed future, but also forced me to re-examine every calculation I'd ever made. Driving home that day, my mind was a storm of bleak possibilities and unanswerable questions. I replayed the conversation in my head, each word from the doctor etching a deeper mark of inevitability into my being. But amidst this turmoil, something caught my eye, a car that I instantly recognized as Laura's. At first, I attributed the sight to a trick of the light or my own preoccupied state of mind. However, as I drove a few cars behind, the realization became undeniable. The driver wasn't her at all, but a young man with an unmistakable air of youthful arrogance and athletic ease. He was no ordinary driver. There was a certain grace in the way he maneuvered the wheel, a poise I'd only seen in professional athletes. I later learned he was Chris, a 24-year-old football star, his confidence radiating through every calculated turn. Even though the distance between us and the mysterious car was roughly 5 vehicles, I could clearly see a reflection of Laura's face in the car's polished mirror, a look that was at once familiar and heartbreakingly foreign. That brief glimpse was enough to ignite a cascade of emotions I'd long thought impossible to experience. Betrayal, shock, and a burning curiosity that defied even the grim diagnosis I'd just received. Without fully understanding why, I felt compelled to follow them. Perhaps it was the ingrained need for control, or maybe it was a desperate attempt to find meaning in the chaos of my crumbling life. I maintained a discreet distance, my eyes locked on their car as we wound through the city streets. Every intersection, every pause at a red light, was an exercise in both restraint and calculation. For 25 long minutes, I trailed them, my heart pounding in time with the rhythmic thump of my tires on the pavement. The journey culminated at an elite motel, a place that reeked of discreet luxury and secrets kept behind closed doors. I parked a few cars back, ensuring I could capture every moment without alerting them to my presence. From my vantage point, hidden in the cloak of twilight and my own conflicted determination, I recorded every detail. The way Laura stepped out of the car, her movements graceful, yet imbued with a hint of defiance, and how Chris greeted her with a casual intimacy that sent a chill down my spine. All of it was documented meticulously by my camera. Every laugh, every lingering touch, was a stark reminder that the life I thought I controlled was unraveling faster than I could calculate its demise. The irony was as bitter as it was painful. Here I was, grappling with the certainty of death in a matter of months, and yet I found myself confronting another form of mortality, the death of the illusion of control over my personal life. All my life, I had treated relationships as a series of strategic moves, a game of chess with predictable outcomes. I had never allowed emotion to interfere with logic, never dared to venture beyond the realm of calculated risk. But now, watching Laura with this young man, I was forced to face a truth that I had long denied. The human heart defies all logic and strategy. As I sat there in the shadows of that elite motel, a mix of anger and sorrow surged within me. I wasn't sure whether the evidence I gathered would serve as vindication, or if it would simply compound the chaos that had become my existence. The betrayal stung deeply, yet in the midst of it, a perverse sense of liberation began to take root. The meticulously ordered life I'd built, driven by discipline and control, was crumbling, both from the inside, with the cancer gnawing at my future, and from the outside, with the revelation of Laura's infidelity. I couldn't shake the nagging thought that perhaps fate had orchestrated this double blow for a reason. Was it merely cruel coincidence? Or was it a final, twisted test of my ability to confront the unpredictable nature of life? The evidence on my camera was indisputable, yet it also presented a challenge. What was I to do with this knowledge when my own time was so tragically limited? In that moment, I realized that my life was no longer about controlling outcomes or calculating risks. It was about facing raw, unfiltered truth, no matter how painful or untimely. I drove away that night with the weight of my mortality and betrayal heavy on my shoulders. Every turn of the wheel reminded me that while I could control my actions, there were forces beyond my reach. Fate, love, and the unpredictable currents of human emotion. And as I replayed the recorded images in my mind, I knew that this wasn't just a moment of personal ruin. It was the beginning of a journey into the heart of what it truly means to live when every second might be your last. In the quiet of the night, with my future reduced to a handful of months and a camera full of damning evidence, I faced an unsettling truth. Sometimes, the greatest control one can have is not over life's outcomes, but over the acceptance of its chaotic, unyielding nature. I reached a point where forgiveness was no longer an option. The sting of Laura's betrayal was too raw, too calculated a wound to allow any semblance of pardon. Instead, I decided to make sure that everything we had built together and everything I had worked so hard for would be preserved for those who truly deserved it. I couldn't let her, with her cavalier disregard for our shared life, walk away with the legacy I had painstakingly constructed. The first step was to secure what mattered most, the business in our house. I knew that the assets had to remain within the family, far away from the reach of someone who had already shown she could manipulate the narrative for her own gain. So I re-registered every asset, every piece of property, transferring them legally to my sister Monica and my children. Daisy, at 23, was on track to become an engineer, a bright, determined young woman with a future that promised stability and innovation. Alex, only 21, was diligently studying to become a businessman, already demonstrating the sharp instincts and diligence that I had once prized above all else. They were the embodiment of what I believed in: loyalty, potential, and the promise of a future built on hard work and genuine connection. It wasn't enough, however, to simply reassign titles and ownership on paper. I needed irrefutable evidence of Laura's duplicity, a final, undeniable confirmation of her choices. So I took the next step and hired a private detective. I laid out my instructions in precise detail: track Laura and document every encounter with Chris. I demanded that no meeting go undocumented. Over the course of 2 weeks, my resolve was met with relentless diligence. The detective returned with a collection of evidence: 7 distinct meetings, each in different locations, each a testament to a betrayal I had long suspected but now had on record. There were clandestine rendezvous in dimly lit hotel corridors, quiet yet charged encounters in secluded coffee shops, and even a few in the hushed corners of upscale bars. Every encounter was captured: photos, videos, detailed logs. I scrutinized every frame, every timestamp, each piece of evidence fueling my determination to see this through. Each documented meeting was like a drop of acid, eating away at the facade of normalcy that Laura had maintained. There was no ambiguity in the evidence. Every stolen moment between her and Chris was recorded, leaving no space for her to claim misunderstanding or misinterpretation. In those images and videos, the truth was laid bare. She was unrepentant in her pursuit of a reckless, forbidden liaison. I felt a grim satisfaction each time I reviewed the evidence, a dark comfort in knowing that I had sealed her fate just as securely as I had sealed my own legacy. In a remarkably short span of 2 weeks, the transformation was complete. Legally, every asset, from the business that had been my pride and labor to the house that held years of memories, had been transferred to Monica, Daisy, and Alex. The paperwork was filed, the legal procedures meticulously followed until there was no doubt left. And the most satisfying part? Laura never even suspected a thing. While she reveled in the false security of normalcy, the entire world of property and financial control had shifted without her ever noticing. The very structures of our shared life were quietly dismantled and reassembled, leaving her with nothing but the remnants of a past built on deceit. As I watched it all unfold, a bitter irony settled over me. I had once believed that control was everything, that every relationship, every asset could be manipulated and directed with precision. But life, it turned out, had a way of appending even the most meticulously laid plans. I had been so consumed with the need to reclaim control over my destiny that I had orchestrated my revenge with the same calculated precision that my father had once drilled into me. The legal transfer was a move that left no room for ambiguity, a final, irrevocable cut from the life I once shared with Laura. Sitting alone in the quiet of my study, surrounded by the weight of signed documents and the damning evidence of her infidelity, I felt a complex mixture of vindication and sorrow. The documents before me were more than just legal papers. They were the embodiment of my final stand, a declaration that my legacy would not be tainted by betrayal. Every signature, every notarized line was a reaffirmation of my commitment to protect what was truly mine, the future of my family. In those final, calculated moves, I reclaimed a semblance of the control I thought I'd lost long ago. Yet, even as I took these steps, the bitter taste of betrayal lingered. The evidence of her infidelity, captured in stark detail by the private detective, served as a constant reminder that the price of control was sometimes paid in heartbreak. I wasn't seeking forgiveness or understanding. I was seeking justice, or at the very least, a way to ensure that my hard-earned legacy would not be squandered by someone unworthy of it. In every meticulously executed legal maneuver and every piece of incontrovertible evidence, I found a strange solace, a reassurance that, even in the midst of personal ruin and the looming shadow of death, I could still steer the course of my own destiny. The days that followed were a whirlwind of legal consultations and final verifications. Each document filed, each asset transferred, reinforced the reality that nothing would be left to chance. My actions were deliberate, calculated, and final. I felt a deep, albeit cold, satisfaction in knowing that my family's future was secured, that Monica, Daisy, and Alex would inherit not just wealth, but the fruits of a legacy built on discipline and resilience. It was a small consolation amid the chaos that had become my life, a final act of retribution that reasserted my belief in the power of control, even when everything else seemed to be slipping away. Now, as I look back on those tumultuous weeks, I see them as a turning point, a moment when I finally decided that I would not be a victim to fate or betrayal. I was steering my own ship, even as the tides of destiny threatened to pull me under. In the legal papers and in the damning evidence stored away in my files, I found the assurance that I had not lost my ability to command the narrative of my life. I had taken back the reins, redirecting the flow of events in a manner that was entirely my own. It was a bittersweet triumph. On one hand, there was the undeniable satisfaction of knowing that I had done everything in my power to protect what was mine. On the other, there was the sorrow of watching a relationship, once filled with promise and potential, disintegrate into a series of cold, calculated moves. Laura had always been a wild card, unpredictable and defiant of any attempt at control. But in the end, her defiance had left her with nothing. The inheritance, the assets, and the legacy that I had built were now safely in the hands of those who had always been true to the values I held dear. Every move I made, every signature on a legal document, was a reminder that even when life dealt its harshest blows, terminal illness, betrayal, and the collapse of a relationship, I could still carve out a measure of control. I could still decide who would benefit from the legacy I had spent a lifetime building. And though the future was shrouded in uncertainty, with my own time now measured in mere months, I took comfort in the thought that my family's future was secured against the backdrop of a world that had grown increasingly unpredictable. In that final act of retribution, I found a grim sort of peace. I had faced the dual demons of betrayal and mortality with the only weapons I knew how to wield: precision, strategy, and an unyielding commitment to control my own destiny. The legal transfer was more than just a safeguard. It was a declaration that my life, however turbulent and painful, would not be defined by the treachery of another. Instead, it would be defined by the legacy I left behind, a legacy that, despite all odds, was now firmly in the hands of those who truly deserved it. It was 45 days after my diagnosis. 45 days when the crushing reality of my terminal illness and the sting of betrayal had fused into a cold, singular purpose. I'd spent countless sleepless nights plotting my next move, each thought measured and deliberate. That night, as the world outside settled into a deceptive calm, I drove to the motel where I knew Laura and Chris would be. The weight of my decisions and the finality of my actions pressed on me, but I remained unervingly composed. I parked a few cars away from the motel, out of sight, yet with a clear view of the entrance and the parking lot. Hidden in the shadows, I retrieved the telescopic bat from its place in my car, a tool as unyielding and precise as the life I'd once managed with such meticulous control. Its metallic surface gleamed under the sparse streetlights, a silent promise of retribution. I wasn't driven by rage alone. I was driven by the necessity to assert that betrayal would not go unanswered, that I would not allow Laura's transgressions to rewrite the rules of my life. Minutes passed in a heavy, expectant silence. Then, as if on cue, I saw their car pull into the lot. Laura's unmistakable presence, even in the dim light, set my heart pounding with a mixture of sorrow and resolve. Chris emerged shortly after, a young man whose confident stride belied the recklessness of his actions. I waited until I could see him clearly, until I could make out every detail of his posture and expression. I recalled the vivid images captured by the detective, the 7 separate meetings that confirmed every suspicion I had harbored. But nothing compared to witnessing it live. The finality of the moment was palpable. As Chris stepped closer to his car, I noticed that his arm was carelessly draped over the roof, a gesture that, in that instance, marked him as vulnerable. In that split second, I knew there would be no more planning, no more calculated moves. This was the final act, and I had rehearsed it in my mind 100 times. I stepped from the shadows, bat in hand, my movements deliberate and fluid. In a flash of motion, I swung the bat with precision. The weapon connected with Chris's arm, the one resting on the roof of the car, in a sickening, hollow thud that reverberated in the quiet night. I watched as his arm jerked, the force of the blow sending shockwaves of pain through him. Without pausing to see his reaction, I pressed on. I brought the bat down sharply on his knee, then struck his elbow, each blow calculated to leave its mark and remind him of the consequences of betrayal. The assault was swift and brutal. Every swing of the bat was executed with the same cold precision that had defined every calculated move of my life. In those few seconds, I felt an odd clarity, a merging of the man I once was, a strategist taught to control every aspect of my existence, and the man who now acted solely on the conviction that some debts must be repaid in pain. But fate, it seems, has a way of interjecting itself when you least expect it. In the midst of the chaos, the distant wail of a siren sliced through the night. A patrol car was passing by, its flashing lights drawing nearer with every heartbeat. I barely had time to register the sound before the world around me erupted into a flurry of shouts and commands. The officer, eyes wide with the shock of witnessing the attack, rushed forward. In a matter of seconds, I was surrounded by the law, a stark contrast to the solitary, determined figure I had been just moments before. They cuffed me swiftly, the cold metal biting into my wrists. As the realization of my arrest settled in, I felt not panic, but a profound calm. I was still in control, even as the officers led me away. The weight of my impending death, the betrayal, and the finality of my actions had all converged into a singular clarity. I wasn't angry anymore, nor was I fearful. I had acted in accordance with the only principles I still held dear: control, retribution, and the unwavering determination to dictate the terms of my own narrative. I watched, detached, as Chris writhed in pain and confusion on the ground. In that moment, every calculated decision of my past, the meticulous planning, the cold legal maneuvers, the painstaking documentation, had led to this inevitable collision of fate and free will. I knew that the world would judge me harshly for what I'd done, that the law would brand me as a violent man driven by unchecked vengeance. Yet, as I sat in the back of the patrol car, the events of the night replayed in my mind like a series of deliberate moves on a chessboard. There was no panic in my heart. I had known the risks when I set my plan in motion, and now I accepted them fully. The arrest was simply another calculated consequence, a final, irrevocable step in a long journey that began with a diagnosis and a betrayal. I had chosen my path, one that diverged sharply from the meticulous order of my former life. In that divergence, I found a strange freedom, an affirmation that even when life seems to strip away every illusion of control, you can still choose how to meet your fate. As the cool night air and the steady hum of the police radio enveloped me, I sat there, calm and resolute. The telescopic bat, now a symbol of my final act, had done its part. And as I was driven away, the chaos of that moment began to settle into an eerie silence. I wasn't seeking redemption, nor did I expect to be understood. I had acted according to a set of principles that, once instilled in me by a lifetime of rigid discipline and strategic calculation, could not be easily discarded, even in the face of imminent death. In the back seat of that patrol car, I found a clarity that was both liberating and terrifying. I had taken the final step against the betrayal that had so thoroughly dismantled my carefully constructed world. Now, as I prepared to face the consequences of my actions, I was at peace, knowing that in the end, I had maintained control over my destiny, even if it meant losing everything else in the process. The trial loomed over me like an inevitable storm, but I was ready for it. The prosecutor laid out his offer: 8 years in prison, followed by 7 years of probation. A deal meant to soften the blow, to provide me with a future after serving my time. But I knew better. There was no future for me. My body was already betraying me, the cancer working its way through my insides with a slow, merciless precision. Accepting the deal meant acknowledging a sentence I would never live to complete, and that was a game I had no intention of playing. So, I refused. The courtroom murmured with quiet disbelief when I declined the deal outright. The prosecutor, the judge, even my own lawyer, they all exchanged glances, silently trying to make sense of my choice. But I simply sat there, unmoved, knowing that their world of long-term consequences meant nothing to a man whose days were already numbered. Let them drag out the trial. Let them argue and debate. It wouldn't matter in the end. Then came the part one wasn't prepared for: Laura. She tried to visit me in prison. At first, I thought it was a mistake, some clerical error that allowed her name onto the visitor list. But then, there she was, sitting on the other side of the thick glass, phone in hand, eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place. Regret? Guilt? Desperation? It didn't matter. I refused to pick up the receiver. She knocked on the glass, whispered my name, tried to get me to listen. I stared through her as if she were nothing more than a ghost. Whatever she had to say, it was too late. I had already buried her in my mind. And then came Chris, the golden boy with the shattered elbow and a broken future. He filed a lawsuit against me, $75 million for a ruined career, emotional distress, and whatever other legal jargon his expensive lawyers could throw at the case. They wanted to strip me of everything, bleed me dry for every cent they thought I had. But they didn't know the truth. Legally, I had nothing. By the time Chris and his legal team came sniffing for money, there was nothing left to take. The house had been sold. The business had been restructured and transferred, and every account had been emptied. There was no empire for them to claim. No bank accounts, no assets, no hidden fortunes waiting to be seized. And then came the best part, the final blow I had so carefully orchestrated. Laura, as my legal wife, was responsible for my remaining financial obligations. And since Chris had calculated his damages at an astronomical $75 million, the legal system did what it does best. It split the liability. Half of the burden landed on Laura's shoulders, a crushing $35 million in debt she would never escape. The life she thought she had secured with her affair, the future she had envisioned with her young, promising lover, had been reduced to nothing more than a financial abyss she could never crawl out of. I wondered if she realized it yet, if she sat awake at night, staring at the endless bills and legal fees stacking up against her, knowing that I had orchestrated her downfall just as meticulously as I had built my empire. If she understood that every meeting, every signature, every calculated move I had made in those final months had been leading to this exact moment. I had nothing left to give her, except ruin. I sat in my cell, staring at the gray walls, listening to the distant echoes of prison life around me. The weight of my body felt heavier each day, the sickness creeping through me like a shadow I couldn't outrun. But there was a certain satisfaction in knowing that even in my final days, I had played the game to the very end. Laura could try to apologize. Chris could try to reclaim what he had lost. But the truth was, they had already lost the moment they underestimated me. And as I lay back on the cold prison cot, a slow, knowing smile crept across my face. The trial never happened. The court delayed the proceedings indefinitely after the doctors confirmed what I already knew. I wouldn't live long enough to see a verdict. Even the justice system, with all its rigid procedures and bureaucracy, couldn't ignore the simple reality that I was running out of time. Instead of a prison cell, I found myself in a hospice, a place for the dying, where the walls hummed with quiet resignation, and where people like me spent their final days waiting for the inevitable. The air smelled of antiseptic and fading hope, but I didn't mind. I had already made my peace with what was coming. Laura tried to reach me. At first, it was through letters passed to me by Daisy and Alex, who still couldn't understand why I refused to read them. They were good kids, better than I probably deserved, and they wanted me to find some sort of closure before I went. But I had already closed that chapter. I burned every letter without reading a single word. The past was ashes, and I had no interest in sifting through them. Daisy and Alex visited nearly every day. They sat by my bedside, sometimes in silence, sometimes trying to fill the void with stories from their lives. I could see the confusion in their eyes, the way they struggled to reconcile the father they had always known with the man who had executed a cold, calculated revenge. I didn't try to explain myself. Some things are too complex to be broken down into simple words, and I wasn't about to waste my breath on justifications. They still stayed. Through it all, through the whispers of the nurses, the endless hum of the machines, and the slow deterioration of my body, they remained by my side. Maybe they didn't agree with what I had done, but they understood one thing. I had done it for them. Then a few days before the end, Laura came. I knew she would. She stood at the doorway for a long time before finally stepping inside. She looked different, older, more fragile, like the weight of everything had finally settled on her shoulders. She sat beside me, her hands trembling in her lap. For a while, she just looked at me, as if trying to find the man she once knew beneath the hollowed-out version that remained. She cried. Through the tears, she spoke in a voice that was softer than I remembered, more broken. She apologized not just for what she had done, but for everything. For the way we had lived, for the way it had all fallen apart, for the love that had turned into something so twisted that neither of us recognized it anymore. Then she said something that made the room feel smaller, like the walls were closing in. She told me she would be waiting for me after death. I let her words settle in the space between us, watching the way her shoulders shook with quiet sobs, the way she clutched at the past like it was something she could still change. And then, with what little strength I had left, I looked at her one last time and whispered my final words. I left you first, and then I closed my eyes. Forever. Laura learned the hard way that the consequences of betrayal don't fade with time. When the dust settled and reality took its final shape, she was left with nothing. No home, no wealth, no security, only a mountain of debt and the weight of a past she couldn't outrun. She tried to fight it at first, tried to negotiate, to plead, but the law didn't care about her tears. She was responsible for the debt, and there was no escaping it. With no other options, she ended up working as a domestic worker. The cruel irony of it all? The only people willing to give her a job were her own children. Daisy and Alex didn't hate her, but they didn't trust her either. She wasn't a mother to them anymore, just another employee. She cooked, cleaned, and managed household tasks under their watchful eyes, earning just enough to make small dents in the enormous sum she owed. Every paycheck was a reminder that the life she had once lived was gone forever. Chris didn't fare any better. The golden boy, once destined for greatness, had been permanently sidelined. His injuries made sure of that. His football career was over before it had even truly begun, and without it, he was just another young man with no prospects and no direction. At first, he tried to live off of sympathy, convinced that someone would take pity on him and offer a new opportunity. But the world moves fast, and fallen stars are quickly forgotten. His parents tolerated him for a while, but after 2 years of watching him waste away in their house, unemployed and unwilling to adapt, they had enough. He was kicked out, forced to navigate a world that no longer cared about what he could have been. There was no safety net, no second chance waiting for him. He had gambled on someone else's wife and lost everything in the process. Monica, the sister who had stood by Richard in his final months, understood when it was time to step aside. She had managed the company long enough to ensure a smooth transition, but she knew it belonged to the next generation. 10 months after Richard's passing, she officially handed over the reins. With a quiet sense of satisfaction, she retired, knowing that the business was in the right hands. Daisy stepped into her role without hesitation. As head of the engineering department, she took her father's legacy and turned it into something even greater. Her mind, sharp and relentless, drove innovation within the company, pushing it into new territories, expanding its reach. She was young, but she carried the weight of responsibility with ease. She was determined to make sure that the company remained strong, not just for herself, but for the father who had sacrificed everything to secure her future. Alex, ever the strategist, took charge of the company's financial affairs. He didn't just maintain the empire Richard had left behind, he expanded it. Every decision was made with careful calculation. Every investment a precise move toward greater success. He had inherited his father's ability to see beyond the present, to plan for what was ahead. Under his leadership, the business didn't just survive, it thrived. Life moved on. The past lingered only in memories and whispered regrets. Laura, broken but still waiting, held on to the belief that she and Richard would meet again in whatever came after this life. She convinced herself that time would eventually bring them back together, that there would be a chance to make things right in some distant eternity. But Richard was gone, and his children, standing at the helm of the future he had fought so hard to protect, never once looked back.